Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to Fighting on Film. Now this week we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Victoria Taylor. Victoria, welcome to the show. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you so much for having me both. I absolutely agree. And I've seen you cover so many films where I thought, oh my God, I wish I could chat with them on that. So it's great to finally have a difficult one to cover, but it will be an interesting one.
Yes. And, we should preface first, Victoria's debut book, Eagle Days, is out on the 22nd, the day after this podcast goes live, so you can all go out and get your copy. Victoria shared some of her book with us, and I'll tell you what, folks, it is a absolute cracker. I really enjoyed reading what I read. So we picked the perfect film to cover this week. It's 1941's Stukas, a German propaganda film that shows the trials and tribulations of a Stuka squadron during the battle for France and the Low Countries. We also will, of course, be pitching your questions from the Patreons, and stick around for the large question. So without further ado, Matt and Victoria, I think I'm into cast. And I've got to admit, there's a lot of chaps in this, a hell of a lot of chaps, but there ain't that many interesting fellows, but I picked four out for us all. We have Karl Radantz as Hauptmann Heinz Bork. Now, he was a prominent Nazi-era German propaganda film leading man, and notable works include Above All Else in the World, a film made to promote Germany's war aims, and June 5th, or June 5, which is a film made about the German invasion of France, but was later banned by Joseph Goebbels. For reasons that I couldn't really find out. I think it was that he didn't want to annoy Vichy France. Then we have O.E. Haas, or Haas, as Oberzart Dr. Gregorius, great name, who would later serve in the Luftwaffe. In 1944, he served in the Luftwaffe, and he'd later appear in post-war films such as Above the Waves, which we've covered before, Matt, if you remember.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't spot him, but fair enough.
No, he's in there. He plays a colonel. I think he's in it for like a couple of minutes. Okay. And then he was in The Doctor of Stalingrad and the French film The Elusive Corporal. Then we have Hans Stelzer as Oberleutnant Hans Wild. He was serving in the Luftwaffe during the war, and he also made an appearance in 1941's Above All Else in the World. And he died in a plane crash in 1944. So he didn't survive the war, but he was in quite a few of these movies, a few of them. And then lastly, rounding them out, because I quite like the name, it's quite apt, we have Ernst von Klipstein as Oberleutnant Patzer von Bomberg. And they call him Bomber in the movie, which is quite great. It's quite good. And he appeared in the unreleased Ritter 1939 film called Legion Condor, about the German legion who flew in the Spanish Civil War. That film was scrapped, apparently, by Joseph Goebbels as well, because he didn't want to sour Soviet relations before, obviously, this is pre-Barbarossa, so he didn't want to annoy the Soviets.
I suppose it would have been coming out just as they were organising the invasion of Poland, etc.
That might have given the game away a little bit there. And then he appeared later in June 5. Post-war, he would feature in a West German-made film called Stalingrad Dogs, Do You Want to Live Forever in 1959. And that's pretty much the key fellows. There's a few more, but they're kind of irrelevant, really. They don't really have... They have a lot to say, but not a lot of things to say of substance. I don't know how everyone else felt about that, but it's...
they're saying a lot, but not really saying much at all, are they?
No, it's very typical of Karl Ritter's films. So Ritter's the director, and he's also a producer, and it epitomizes his style in terms of it being very sort of chatty, but shouting over each other, and they're very hyped and nationalistic. And to be honest, the energy is very reminiscent of Hitler's speeches. It feels like you're watching that. It's the absolute machine gun of dialogue. And of course, it's meant to be like that. Nazi propaganda is meant to be bombarding your ears until it gets drilled into your brain. And I think that really epitomizes this movie. So it's quite hard going to watch at certain points.
Yeah, it's almost like beer hall dialogue, isn't it? It's just constant chatter. It's very much a wall of a wall of joviality at the beginning of the film for sure. Well, that kind of segues me nicely into production. So as you mentioned there, Victoria, obviously directed by Karl Ritter, who was himself a pilot, a World War One veteran in the Bavarian army, I believe I read. A very ardent Nazi, joined very early on. Think he might have even been in the just about triple digits in terms of party membership in his area, and joined in 1925. Apparently, he also flew a Stuka to get the feel for it in occupied France while making the film, which I thought was quite hands-on and interesting. Just to run through some of his films, as Victoria mentioned, that Ritter was one of the quintessential Nazi propaganda directors and producers. Films like The Traitor 1936, Holiday on the Word of Honor, which is a terrible translation of the German title, but there we are, which is about a couple of chaps in 1918 that go home on leave and encounter some left-wing revolutionaries. I bet they didn't enjoy that meeting. What else we got? Operation Michael 1939, which is again about Operation Michael in 1918. Condor Legion, as Rob mentioned, or Legion Condor, I should say. Über alles der Welt, which is above all else, 1941. That probably one of his best known propaganda movies. GPU 1942, which is an anti-Soviet film. And Crew Door in 1943, which is another Luftwaffe film. Obviously being a pilot and that being an area of interest for him, he seems to have gravitated towards doing these films about the Luftwaffe, even if Joseph Goebbels didn't always let him finish them. As Victoria mentioned, he was also a producer, and he also co-wrote the film with Felix Lutskendorf, who was a frequent collaborator with Ritter. Worked on Leave on the Word of Honor, Legion Condor as well, and Cadets in 1939. So again, there's a lot of collaboration with the same sort of group of people that you see throughout the production side of things, and that carries over to the chaps who handled the music and the cinematography as well. In terms of the score, Herbert Vint, probably one of the most significant composers for Nazi propaganda films in terms of scores. Collaborated with Riefenstahl on Triumph of Will and Olympia, worked on Nordlicht 1938. Again, also was going to be working on Legion Condor, Feldzug Poland, about the operations in Poland, War in the West, Bismarck's Dismissal, The Red Terror 1942, all of these.
Definite theme here, isn't there, Matt, with these movies?
There's a definite theme quintessential Nazi propaganda films. And that kind of rounds out production side of things. I don't want to go into the cinematographers too much and that kind of thing as we normally do. Is there were quite a few of them that worked on this, and they all, I'll give the game away, they all worked on Nazi propaganda films quite a bit. So it'd be just me repeating Nazi propaganda film names that we've already mentioned, so it's probably not worth our time.
You have an absolutely amazing retro review this week though, don't you, Matt?
The Nazi spirit and ethos of the young Luftwaffe Eagles of the sky, terrifically good with magical aerial photography. And that was Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels in his diary in June 1941.
Incredible.
I think we've ever done Goebbels as the retro review on the show.
You'll never do that again. And the whiplash into the one-word reviews is amazing here. And Eddie Bond goes with Flydy. Brian Williams says sirens. Adam Christian put a gif of a siren. A lot of sirens this week because of Stukas, I guess.
Wonder why.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Jay McN says Achtung. Brian Williams also goes with Achtung. Nick Lahari says Balderdash. Peter Paint goes Jericho's trumpets even. And Alan Taylor rounds us out with Rudel. So, yeah, I was quite surprised a lot of the Foff faithful had seen it, or at least they knew the sirens from a Stuka. So,
yeah, I'm really not surprised to see the sirens take center stage in the comments. You know, the Jericho's trumpet, even though it's not used as often in battle as people think, it's used more in Poland, although it actually gets incredibly frustrating for the Stuka pilots to listen to, because when you think how loud it is just listening to it on a film, and the fact that the sound is so evocative that it's still used in films today, any kind of bomb dropping or plane crashing, imagine having that right up to your eardrum, when you're trying to concentrate, when you are tipping over into a 60 to 90 degree dive and you need to concentrate on your bearings and surroundings, having that in your ear is just horrific, Yeah. So I'm not surprised, though, because it's such a evil genius in a way. It's awful because you're creating even more terror and destruction on the ground, particularly for civilians of occupied territories or rather quickly captured territories. And it's horrific for them. It's horrific for the soldiers underneath as well that are subjected to the Stuka. But it's also so clever because it amplifies the terror that's already coming from being dive bombed. And the Stukas really did pride themselves on being accurate. They'd had some time. Funnily enough, of course, we've mentioned the film The Condor Legion. They'd had time to start to hone their practices in the Spanish Civil War to the point that they'd actually started to bomb specific Spanish villages and towns. And then they would go and take photographs of the damage straight after and try and trace all of the bomb damage to see how accurate they've been. So it's already a terrifying aircraft to come up against in 1939, 1940. But then it's just even more terrifying because of that siren, and it just makes it truly distinctive.
Yeah, it's definitely it's become a bit of a pop culture thing as well. You often hear that overlaid on stock footage that hasn't even got Stukas in it. In a World War II documentary or something like that. It's become one of those kind of enduring sounds. And talking to Stuka, I think, Matt, it's time to get into the alley tally this week. What do you think?
I think so.
As you'll know, Fighting on Film and Warfare Media partnered up to give our listeners a huge discount on high-quality Cold War posters. But now there's more. Warfare Media also offers clothing and the chance to order OP4 DPM camouflage uniforms. Support the podcast and use the code FOF20 at checkout for 20% off your order. Don't delay, visit warfaremedia.net today.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So I think we'll kick off the Alley Tally with a question for Victoria from our Patreons. So AD Bond asks, Stukas proved vulnerable during the Battle of Britain and had to be withdrawn. Were lessons learned when they got deployed during Barbarossa?
Excellent question. So the Stuka's often seen as really losing a lot of its luster, or rather its danger, its lethality in the Battle of Britain because it struggles. It's an aircraft that does get that vulnerability because of the fact that its cruising speed and even its top speed are so much slower than the Spitfire and the Hurricane, that they do incur significant losses in the Battle of Britain. But the thing is that because they're withdrawn, I think we often get this image that the Germans then considered them absolutely useless in the Battle of Britain. And that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, all of the different units, whether they were Bf 109s, whether they were Bf 110 Zerstörers, they all have points where they hit significant losses at certain points. So the Stukas didn't suffer as much from a percentage perspective as is often claimed. They actually recovered their losses relatively quickly and were able to hold on to them, considering that they weren't really deployed so much later on in the Battle of Britain after those sort of August days. So as a result, I don't think they are particularly affected by the Battle of Britain going into Operation Barbarossa the next year. What is affected more keenly is actually the number of German bombers, largely because not only have you got the issue of the Battle of Britain itself, but you've got the 600 German bombers that are lost in the Blitz on top of those losses. And because German aircraft production really lags in 1941, and I think it only has a rise of about 8.8% compared to the previous year. They do start to have issues with their bombers as opposed to their dive bombers. And by the time the Americans come into the war at the end of 1941, they're down to between 20 to 30% of their authorized strength. So the Stukas, as far as I know, were not quite so affected. They were also a bit more adaptable in a way. They could be put into different fronts. They become more important on the Mediterranean and attacking Allied shipping and convoys. Later, of course, it's funny, one person mentioned Rudel. Of course, he's very well known with going into 1943 and going into a tank busting role. So the Stuka hasn't got the same mystique that it used to have. In terms of its strength, it's still put in the areas where it is best suited. I don't think it loses its allure entirely. In terms of its numbers, it's not as directly affected as some of the other parts of the Luftwaffe arms.
I suppose it's a very different enemy they're facing as well in Russia as well. So
yes,
I suppose there's, that has to be taken into account as well.
It does. And also, I mean, if you look at just Barbarossa, the opening months are still very effective. It does work very well. It goes with its opening trick of blitzkrieg. It manages to crumple thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground, and of course Stukas are involved in that. So the initial impact is still impressive with the Luftwaffe, despite the delay that's come from the Balkans campaign. But at the same time, it is an accumulative thing. And once Barbarossa starts getting stretched out, that's when you start to get all of those issues heading into 1942.
The film does a good job of because it's a propaganda film, so it holds up the Stuka like it's this, like it's Wunderwaffe, it's this war-winning machine. It can bomb anything, it can hit anything on a dime, which I kind of love. It kind of just it's the movie to me. I've got in my final thoughts notes is that it's an advert for the Stuka. It's 90 minutes of Stuka advertising, which I kind of love. But in FOF style, me and Matt we were chatting on the FOF WhatsApp when we were watching this, and the sheer amount of French kit on display here is incredible. You've got French fighter planes depicted, or even Belgian. I couldn't make them out, which is just incredibly, incredibly rare for certainly Western movies. Even now, we don't really get many French depictions. But you've got a lot of this kit, of course, was captured after Dunkirk. And after the battle for France, so they've got scores of these tanks. So you've got French Renault R35 tanks. The German designation at that time would have been the PZKPFW 35R. Of course, everything the Germans captured and reran got its own designation, which I thought was interesting, and I do think it's interesting. But and some great stock footage in use as well from Devok and Schau. Film reels. You've got a Char C2 that turns up. It's really, really cool. Fortunately, we don't see one running, but that would have been amazing. But I think,
well, they only ever built 10 of them, and they destroyed 8 of them on the train that they were stuck on. So that's why they probably didn't have any for the film.
Yeah, I just think it's really great that the stocks of kit they've got to use here makes maybe unintentionally maybe one of the best depictions of the battle for France. And
there's a full squadron of R35s.
Exactly.
That's really, really interesting, because the way it's shot as well from aerially, it gives a good idea of the scale of a tank squadron going into action. It's probably the only time we'll see anything close to a RAS getting depicted.
Yeah, I thought it was a RAS when they talk about it's overwhelming power, like we're going to get overrun, and that you got those German troops, I think, are like an artillery spotting unit or something, trying to get overrun. And I was like, is this a RAS? Like, it'd be the only film depiction of a RAS going. I thought that was amazing. Really, really good stuff. What else have we got here? Oh, yeah, me and Matt have to mention it. It might be odd for this episode, but we have to give, I'll just explain for Victoria, listeners might know, we have a thing on the show, wherever we see a animal in a war film, they get awarded a fighting or film award for an animal in a war film, which we've called the Hoofder. So this week we're giving out another Hoofder for the bull that is brought into sort of, I think, for some reason. He pulls
the piano in, doesn't he? He pulls the piano.
He pulls the piano in.
The crucial piano. The alliest piece of kit in the whole film is the piano that they lug in and spend a good chunk of film around and playing. That piano gets almost as much time as the Stukas does.
May I also give a honorary award, or rather sort of a commiseration prize, to the dog that's getting throttled for its life. There's a mascot in it at one point, a squadron mascot, and they're passing the dog amongst them. And I think it's just that they probably have never had a dog. And this poor dog is like, its eyes are popping, like trying to be passed among the German airmen. So, I'm sure the dog wasn't a Nazi. I hope it wasn't. And so I think an award
didn't look like it from the way he was acting.
It.
I'll say that much.
for coping with that. It was, oh my God. I mean, Peter would not be happy these days.
No. Two Hoofters this week. Amazing. We had a mongoose a couple of weeks ago from Planter's Wife. So we're threatening to do an episode where we just do an awards show for the animals. And we might have to do it at this rate. But no, I mean, Matt, anything? I think it might be time for another guest question. Matt, what do you think?
I think so. And I think a good one comes from Westerly AL, and he asks, I'd like to ask about whether Stuka pilots had problems with G forces at any point, because obviously you mentioned there the steep inclines that they dived into. Did they have any flight suits that made it easy to deal with, or other things like that?
I don't think they particularly, at this stage of the war, they didn't have particularly specialized flight suits. They did certainly struggle with the danger of blacking out because of the intense G-forces that were on them. And as previously mentioned, sometimes they would be going into a complete vertical dive almost. And the pull-up from that is insane. So they do struggle with it in this period. Of course, they do go through intensive training to make sure that they are able to cope with it. And they very much handpicked the Stuka crews for those that had the stomach for it, because, of course, so many recruits, their stomachs couldn't take normal flights, let alone being in a Stuka, which is a white knuckle ride. So I think in terms of the provisions, really, it's not much different to what was there today in terms of the actual techniques used. They knew that they needed to squeeze the blood back in their feet and their legs to get the blood back up to their brains. But really, it was just absolutely risking it all. I could be wrong. There could have been certain provisions, but my understanding is in this period that if they were very rudimentary, and they're sort of going on grit at this stage.
Yeah. They seem they're wearing like what I assume would be like kind of beige coloured overalls over their dress uniforms here. Like we're not quite, we're not into sort of, American plugging yourself into the bomber for warmth.
Yeah,
we're not really in that. We're not in that level yet. I mean, which kind of shocked me, because I thought, well, you might have some sort of specialized jacket or specialized something, but I've got to take the film as it is, and I assume that is what your bog standard pilot's wearing. It's quite it's quite interesting.
Well, some of the visual markers that are in the Stuka, you can see them in the film, and one of the main aspects that you'll spot is on one of the side windows. There is like a little diagram that's got different angles of the lines. So having that does help you to determine which angle you need to be at, but also how you need to pull up. But in terms of the actual suit, there's not as much provision. The help within the Stuka itself is that there is a mechanism that is designed to help pull them out of the dive, and it's a bit of an automatic brake. So this helps them to kind of, when they're going down into the dive, so they don't lose quite so much control, and they're able to make it a little bit more streamlined and to recover more easily. Now, that is a bit hit and miss, and some Stuka pilots don't like to fly with it. They actually find it, they prefer the fluidity of being able to pull out when they want to. But it's certainly a fascinating mechanism, and it is quite advanced for the time on the Stuka itself, because in some ways it's quite obsolete or a little bit old-fashioned in terms of the fact that it's got this gull wing and those sort of elements, and it's known as that, being a pig, it's actually nicknamed as being a pig because it's very ungainly, and it's not particularly pretty to look at. But that technology likely saved countless lives, because it allowed them to be pulled up, but also to not completely lose their bearings and surroundings, and make sure that, even if they are not quite paying attention to their own physiology and how they're feeling, the aircraft is sort of doing it for them.
I quite like the movie, in a way, I think it accidentally highlights the how, to me at least, I could be wrong, but how kind of lightly armored the Stuka is. And you've got this stock footage that of right near the end with I think they're Hurricanes and Spitfires attacking in the stock footage, but in the movie they've got some models of Spitfires, because they're all terrified of Spitfires. They wouldn't mention a Hurricane at all. No one wants to be shot down by a Hurricane. But I liked how the movie kind of shows these Stukas almost dogfighting with better planes for dogfighting. It's like, it's so propagandistic, this Stuka with its turning circle and everything else really can go up against a Spitfire. It really can go up against a French fighter.
My God.
I love that. It was great, and how accurate the gunners were and things like that.
The rear, the doctor in the rear gun position, like just easily knocking out attacking aircraft on his first flight. Just pure skill. Pure Nazi
That's
skill.
impressive.
Latent.
That's impressive. your Nazi skill. Yeah, that's the thing. They really do present the Stuka almost as a fighter equal to the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And you sort of think, well, okay. I mean, yes, of course, there was the occasional Stuka that did knock out a fighter, although, of course, it was more likely that they'd be finishing off one that's already been attacked by a German fighter from the escort. But I would say it was perhaps more likely with the German bombers, really. I mean, they tended to have, they've got more of a dedicated turret. I mean, the Stuka does have one, but it's not really the best position because it's already very vulnerable when it's in a dive. And how often is an aircraft going to come exactly directly on top of you whilst you're diving? So really, a Stuka pilot is quite limited.
The movie really
in how
omits
they can use their guns.
Any anti-air at any point, doesn't it? Like there's, it's like the one thing that could down a Stuka isn't in this movie. I think there's one Hotchkiss machine gun.
There's one on a Hotchkiss, on an anti-aircraft mount, and there's one like anti-aircraft gun that's seen firing. And then they mentioned that a couple of the guys that disappear, that you never see disappear, were probably downed by ground fire. Before we move away from the alley tally, I've got a great question from Tom Cope, who asks, speaking of turrets and small aircraft, who'd win a fight between a Defiant and a Stuka?
Oh wow!
Defiant gang, come on.
It's got to be that. Surely it's the Defiant. I mean, the Defiant, of course, is technically designed to be a fighter, so that's in its corner immediately. But to be honest, it's not all that effective in this period, unless it's kind of the Germans feared more that a bolt and pull Defiant would become underneath their aircraft and they'd sort of be sandwiched by a Spitfire or a Hurricane on top. And this was very much heard by some of the Luftwaffe crews that were captured during the Battle of Britain. That was more when they were concerned about coming in.
Was that an actual threat?
I don't know if it was done as a specific tactic or whether it's something that they just happened to experience, if it was a bit of a chaotic mix of, two British fighters trying to get to them. I would say Defiant. And I think it's also because, I mean, the Stuka once it had come out of a dive, it was very, very vulnerable. So if it was taking any dives in an evasive way to try and position itself around a Defiant, it's put all of its speed and its energy into the dive. So trying to recover, that's not what it was designed to do. It's designed to dive. And so I would give it to the Defiant. But I think it'd be quite a painful dogfight to watch, to be honest. It wouldn't be quite as enthralling maybe as a Spitfire.
Lumbering planes, trying to get behind each other so they can use their turret. It'd be quite funny to see. So the one thing I did want to ask, just from my side, the movie doesn't show at any point Stukas with fighter cover. Now, is that a thing that comes in later, or are they always being escorted with fighter cover, or is it just sometimes they don't have it?
I think it's partially a decision to focus on the Stuka, and if they start showing cooler aircraft, if they start showing sleeker BF-109s and 110s, then I think it would take away some of the focus from the Stuka. Certainly in the Battle of Britain, there was the intention that all Stukas needed to be escorted where possible, and most ended up being operational in a way that they expected the BF-109s and the BF-110s to escort them. But it was incredibly frustrating for the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots because they had to deal with the fact that the Stukas were so much slower. So Gunther Raul, for instance, is very famous BF-109 pilot. He said about how, this is as much fun as trying to get a hedgehog down an autobahn safely. He says about how it's this frustration of the fact that the BF-109s are struggling with having to try and keep pace with the Stukas. They want to go out on their free hunt, but of course if they end up flying too far out, then the Stukas are very much vulnerable to British fighters. And he describes it in a really evocative way. He says about how what they have to do is try and go out in front when they're escorting the Stukas. I think this is around the Channel Battle, actually, he describes this. And they've basically got to try and stop the traffic coming through. He describes it as you've got to stop the traffic coming through, because if you flank the sides of the hedgehog, then the hedgehog is going to get run over. Whereas if you go in front of the hedgehog and you stop the traffic, then the hedgehog can go through. So as you can see, there was not much respect for the Stukas in terms of the speed that they could go out for the fighter pilots. But it was normally intended that they should have fighter escorts where possible. Although, to be fair, in some of the earlier campaigns, it just wasn't necessary all the time. You know, when you've got overwhelming force against, the Polish Air Force and the Belgian Air Force and some of these different nations, which fought tenaciously but do not have the numbers or the tools really to stage an effective defence. In some cases, they didn't need that. And of course, they weren't really escorted so much in the Spanish Civil War because they didn't have to be. It wasn't that kind of war.
I think as well, it's probably the movie trying to sort of hide these things from the audience. You know, we're trying to show the German war machine in the most positive light we can. And we don't want to show that our maybe not quite so hot fighter bomber needs it's like escorting a Skoda with a Ferrari. You know, they don't want to show that in a way. They wouldn't dream of doing it. But no, I think that maybe is what the movie's doing there. So I think that moves us on, Matt and Victoria, to favourite scenes.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
So, Victoria, as you're the guest, we're gonna throw it over to you and ask, what is your favourite scene from Stukas? I know it's a bit difficult. We talked about this before we started recording, didn't we?
We did. So it's difficult to say what is the favourite scene in terms of the fact that this is clearly a hyped up Nazi charm offensive, and it's very frustrating. I sort of call it's Nazi smarm is the genre. And it's just very frustrating to watch so much of it and see people get suckered into such simplistic worldviews. But of course it was very effective. I think there's perhaps not a favourite scene, but I perhaps do have a favourite line. And it's not that imaginative, because I think that the Nazi propaganda often regurgitates a lot of its material. And I don't think people realise, for instance, that a lot of the propaganda that the Luftwaffe, or more specifically Nazi Germany, puts out during the Battle of Britain, for instance, is repeated from the First World War. So that's a little bit more of a different rabbit hole. I can go down that if you'd like, or go straight back to the question. But it's very repetitive. They talk about the fact that there are no longer any islands, and that's from the First World War. They talk about storming Albion, that's from the First World War. There's all those different moments where it's very repetitive, but I do find it interesting. There's a line in it which is about how regular people fear the Reaper. And talking about the fear of death. And the chap says, personally, I prefer to see death as a dance. And it's one of those things where it's not hugely imaginative, but I think it's an interesting bit of looking into the psyche of some of these flyers, which, irrespective of which nation you're fighting for, you do have to make peace with the maker in some way to do what you do, and that you are confronted with death on a daily basis. And this does happen in the film as well. It doesn't entirely keep death out of the picture. And of course, part of that is for national sacrifice. And that's so strong at the end of the film, where the doctor says about how, not one too many Germans have fallen for the beloved fatherland and all this kind of stuff. But I do find it interesting because they always say, irrespective of their nationality, it's like, I always hoped and believed that death wouldn't happen to me. And that they weren't there to be collected. They're there to dodge it. So I think that was a really interesting angle, really. I think it's one of those that it was quite provocative. It did make me think for a while, and sort of saw that connection of many war films. But in terms of a favourite scene, I think when they stopped playing the damn piano, because they play the piano throughout this damn film the whole time, and I'm just like, and to be fair, you can't blame some of the Luftwaffe airmen for rolling their eyes every time they start, because you just think, oh God.
Yeah, they always looked incredibly bored when they were on the ground.
Yeah.
They were the way they're poised is that they always want to be up in the air. It's like they're sort of like calling their their purpose. It's interesting that you talked about the First World War connotations there. I picked up a little bit of it here and there in the movie because it was a lot of subtitle reading and a lot of translations that might not have been perfect on the subtitling. I saw that as almost as if the movie is trying to tell its audience, because we have to remember, listeners, that this is a propaganda movie. You know, its purpose is to, you know, tell you something. And I saw it as kind of, because at this point, 1940, 41, when this movie comes out, we're right in the war. You know, Germany is winning at this point. You know, it must be said. I saw it as kind of trying to manipulate your audience into buying into something like, well, this war we're kind of continuing the first one, and we're actually that's actually the reason why we're fighting, is that we have something that we need to finish almost. It was like you know, don't think about the reasons why of why we might be fighting now. This is actually continuing 1918. It was an interesting thing to sort of pull on, I thought.
Yes, I think the kind of sense of national community and sacrifice, they are very much pushed by the Nazi regime in many regards. And I think this was felt particularly strongly during the Battle of France, because that campaign, it really buys into the sort of Langemarck myth and that level of young men of Germany that, you know, the seeds that have been sown by the men of the First World War are now blooming in the Second. And they saw it as this kind of karma, you know, against what they saw as France having inflicted upon them in terms of pushing for certain restrictions and land being taken away at Versailles and those sort of elements after the First World War. So I think there is a bit of a vengeful element to it. I think the Battle of France really brings that up strongly. And there's definitely the thing I find interesting, which they still let slide through, and this is what's fascinating about what Nazi propagandists wanted people to take away, is you'd think they would try and show the Germans as being entirely honorable and noble and treating the French population with respect and that kind of thing. And actually, they don't hide it. They don't hide the disdain shown by the Luftwaffe airmen towards the French population. I mean, they lock, for context for the listeners, if you've not seen the film, they end up shoving in this poor old French woman whose house they've broken into, some of the downed Luftwaffe airmen, and they shove her in there and they treat her horribly and they take her food. And then later on, they end up manipulating a really kindly French woman who offers to get a doctor. They've gone under the pretenses of them being injured French and British airmen and that kind of thing. And they've tried to sort of, you know...
They get a nice dig in at the British, though. The British thieves are here. You know, one of the French women says. Yeah. And I'm like, that's a good dig. Nice little dig there.
Yes.
You know?
the English thieves. Yes, because that they end up pretending to be British, the ones that are in the... I think it's with the old lady, isn't it? Where they end up saying, you know, they start shouting at her in English. And of course, she's like, oh my God, English robbers kind of thing. So they're turning against the English and the French and, you know, putting in that division between the two.
I thought there was a couple of interesting points around that. The bit of the dialogue between the French soldiers at the very end of the film and the captured airman, where he convinces an entire company of French troops to surrender, because they're being attacked by aircraft, which they've never experienced before. Obviously, in the last 6 weeks.
French, it's like adding to that myth. The French just laid down their arms in 1940. They didn't. You know. Sorry, Matt. I just thought it was interesting.
There's a great line where he says, "You're fighting the Englishman's war for him," which I thought was very good. I like that a lot. For me, my favourite scenes are the ones that show the French and the actual Wehrmacht on the ground. I think some of the most interesting bits are the depictions of the German troops, where they're stoic and brave, but they're also chaotic and not as you know, capable as the Luftwaffe, which I think is an interesting kind of dichotomy.
Inter-service bashing there, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, maybe so.
And then the little bit where they do a bit of sort of like combined arms, and they direct the Stukas onto the French tanks by is it a smoke screen or like something they do on the ground?
Yeah.
They like burn an arrow into the ground or something like that.
It was beautifully big spotting scopes the Germans used. I love those.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult to pick a favorite scene from the film. I mean, I wasn't about to pick the ludicrous kind of climax of the film where the pilot suffering from battle fatigue
Oh God,
is restored by the power of Wagner. And we then get a 5-minute montage of him imagining being super excited to go back to the front, and then actually being super excited to go back to the front.
Yeah,
it's so weird the way they shot that. Like, if him
it's like
daydreaming
a
while
coming of
listening,
age movie in that regard.
It's
It's a
bizarre.
really weird sequence. Yeah, and he gets out of his depression really quickly. It's like, I want to go dive bombing again. Oh, gee whiz. Like, it's really weird. I'll echo Matt there. I mean, obviously it's a hard movie to say you have a favourite scene because of the subject matter and the propagandicness of it. I do enjoy the Battle for France sequences purely because there aren't that many depictions of them.
Exactly.
Anyway, for doing it in 1940 and doing it so well, and this is this movie. Obviously, German propaganda movies anyway have very high levels of production value even now. If you put this movie out in the mid 50s, I still think it is high up there. It has a high level of production value. I love the back projection, the use of models, the intercutting of stock footage. Technically, it's a very good movie. I think we should give it props for that.
I like the shots where they go into the dive, and what they do is they simply just tilt the camera, and do that. I think that was quite a clever little camera
From a
technique.
technical point of view, I did enjoy it, and I think for me it is those French sequences. And yeah, I think that probably brings us on to final thoughts. But before we do, let's ask another question. So Brian Williams asks, did the Luftwaffe, both as a body and its individual pilots, see themselves as chivalric knights of the sky?
Oh, excellent question, and one that very much leads into my book, actually, Eagle Days, Life and Death for the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Yes, they do. Some of it is the fact that after the Second World War, a lot of the Luftwaffe men knew far too much about the Nazi regime, what it was involved in, even some of its more chivalric pilots, those that had kind of cultivated a sense of being honourable in combat, both in their mind, but also sometimes in some of the testimonies from the Allied pilots they came up against. They didn't always want to face the truth of what they had actually fought for, or rather what they felt they'd been manipulated into fighting for. And as an example, for instance, Johannes Steinhoff was a very prominent Luftwaffe fighter ace that worked a lot with English-speaking audiences after the war. And in some ways, he needs to be given credit in terms of opening up some of those uncomfortable conversations. He helped to edit Voices from the Third Reich, which is a really important book. I think it's around the 1980s, that brings in voices from those that had suffered in the Holocaust, as well as individuals in the Wehrmacht. But he also mentioned about how he did admit around the time of the Warsaw Uprising, he'd heard about the SS creating this, in quotes, clever way of eliminating Jews during the Holocaust. And he said about how I couldn't assess that information. I was a fighter pilot. I was busy with daily operations. And he tried to be a little bit... The fighter pilots revolt, which comes towards the end of the Second World War and which sees certain individuals in the Luftwaffe try and remove Goering as the commander-in-chief and to put Robert Ritter von Greim in his place. Steinhoff's a little bit cheeky in the way that he says, the fighter pilots revolt came too late and we didn't know about the concentration camps. And he tried to create this military revolt as if it were a political one. And it's not the same thing at all, particularly when Goering was disgraced by that point of the war. So it was still a brave thing to do, but it wasn't this great resistance coup against the Holocaust that he sort of tried to imply. And so they knew a lot. And the Battle of Britain was specifically, they latch onto that more because that's seen as a bit more of a gentlemanly war that's a little bit more equal. The Battle of France, for instance, it's not the same way when you have campaigns that are so quickly concluded by the Luftwaffe, because they know they can't really cling to things like that because it is the brutal it is the brutal occupation of different countries. They can't really talk about that in the same way because there's that absolute domination across continental Europe. But the Battle of Britain they latch onto as being particularly chivalric because it is seen as a bit more of a honourable joust in the skies, and it's also a narrative that is somewhat supported by the RAF Fighter Command after the war, because some of it is a genuine need for reconciliation after the war. They do start to strike up certain friendships. I think Adolf Galland and Douglas Bader is perhaps the best known. And so some of it is of benign and benevolent origins to some degree. But at the same time, it is beneficial to both sides, because if the RAF is seen as having taken on an enemy that is as noble as itself, then that helps to kind of justify that knightly language that surrounds the Battle of Britain. And it benefits the Luftwaffe too, because at the end of the day, this is something they can latch onto in the British psyche of, oh, well, you remember those glorious days of 1940. And of course, there were certain moments of great respect between the two. There was the sense of letting each other's fighter go if it was injured with nothing more than a wave. But of course, there is also the occasional strafing of parachuting troops, or rather pilots. There's also the fact that the British fire on a lot of the German air sea rescue vessels and things like that. So that from both sides, there's moments that are a bit less gentlemanly. But I think on the whole, they saw themselves as being, I think the fighter pilots specifically, the Jagdflieger, they were more of that ilk. They prided themselves on that. They thought when there was the bombing that had started with the Blitz, they felt it was they should not be attacking civilian populations, and they felt that sense of, this is not what we want the Luftwaffe to represent. Although, of course, that's so naive. It's one of those things that either it's naive at best, at worst, it's just ignoring the fact that they had facilitated that kind of destruction against civilians for months by this point, if not years, if you count the Spanish Civil War. So, yeah, it's they see themselves as being knights of the sky, but they also know that presenting themselves as such to the British and to other Allied pilots after the end of the war is very beneficial to them when National Socialism is such a stain.
I think that quite nicely answers another question from one of our patrons, Lloyd Crawford, who asked, do you think pilots dive bombing London felt differently about attacking British civilians than they did, say, at Guernica? And he continues, I know the Nazis were motivated by a sense of racial superiority. I was wondering if this led to mixed feelings when attacking a country that they felt some small amount of respect for, or whether they gotten that out of their system by the fall of France. So it definitely already touched on some of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's perhaps among the pilots themselves, there's not quite as much evidence within the letters of how they feel about attacking Britain. I think when I've looked at their field letters, they've tended to talk more about their immediate day-to-day concerns. Occasionally you do see vengeful sentiments come through, I think mainly after the fall of France, and they talk about in certain letters, although it's not always the flying arms, but sometimes it's in the ground crews as well, or air signals units or anti-aircraft gunners. They do sometimes describe the British as being beasts or being warmongers, or that they can't wait to settle business with this wretched bunch, as one says. But in terms of if they feel differently about the bombing of civilians in Britain, you kind of have to read through the lines a little bit more. I mean, I find it interesting, for instance, with Werner Baumbach, who's a Luftwaffe bomber pilot. He describes the Battle of Britain as being the point where they're trying to get the air superiority. And then when he looks at the Blitz, he calls that the industrial phase of the Luftschlacht um England, or the air battle for England. So he calls it industrial. It's not against civilians, it's industrial. And so you do see certain points where they feel the need to censor themselves. And so I think they knew on some sort of level that this was not fully correct. Of course, the fighter pilots were going to say after the end of the war, well, we thought it was awful. But there's other Luftwaffe personnel in this period who believe that this is just a natural step in the invasion. I mean, how are you going to carry out an amphibious invasion of Britain if you're not going to take and subdue the capital? So some of them still see it. The idea of an invasion has been very much drilled into the Luftwaffe, at least among the lower ranks, even if the upper command is wavering considerably on Sea Lion. But a lot just see it as the intensification, the escalation of the air war that will be necessary in order to pave the way for Sea Lion. So they don't always necessarily see it as, oh, they're attacking British civilians. They see it as the natural continuation of the campaign. And of course, London was the original target. The idea of the Eagle attack is that it was going to slowly go in sort of concentric circles and move closer and closer to London. So in a lot of cases, they just see Goering as having jumped the gun. But I think the fighter pilots feel it far more keenly because, now they've got to try and adapt to something entirely different to what they've been doing so far, attacking RAF airfields and radar installations.
Just picking up on some of the things that you've been describing there, like, is there from your research, is there a sense of the Luftwaffe kind of, or at least some of the men feel like they're fighting a separate war? Because it sounds a little bit like some of them feel that way. I don't know. Like, is that a thing?
Yes. So by a separate war, I assume you mean as in they feel as if all of it's on their shoulders and that the Army and Navy...
what they're doing is their own kind of battle. It's their own
disconnect.
Thing. A disconnect from the party, maybe the means, something like that.
Yeah. Yes, they definitely do. General de Flieger Paul Deichmann, for instance, says he describes it as there's no army attacking, there's no navy attacking, and it is an unprecedented campaign in the Battle of Britain. It is a sense of when we look at the Battle of France, for instance, that's still operating in the traditional blitzkrieg domain, which they've started to hone over several different campaigns. And that's what they're used to. That's what they end up going towards again in future campaigns post Battle of Britain and Blitz. But they felt very much isolated in the Luftwaffe. It's not entirely reasonable for them to feel that way when we look at the full context of things, because the Army and the Navy were very much consumed by Sea Lion and the planning of it. And to be fair, it wasn't really their fault that it had become an aerial campaign. And I think they tried to plan as much as they possibly could. They had discussions over how many divisions they could get across. They conducted joint operations with the Luftwaffe to simulate Sea Lion. And it's even so involved to the point that they end up creating, the Army has plans to film some instructional videos for Sea Lion in early 1941. So it's not quite as detached as the Luftwaffe feels, but I also think that it's not surprising that the Luftwaffe feels so vulnerable because this hasn't been done before. An aerial campaign that is designed to be the decisive moment, and the fact that air power is meant to balance the scales and make sure that the Luftwaffe is able to continue its successes, it hasn't been done. So it's no wonder that it feels really concerned, and also it's very much at the mercy of what the other branches of the Wehrmacht can do, because they might be able to get the air superiority or the air supremacy, but then if the other branches aren't ready, then you've done it for nothing. So it felt very isolating to them. But I think they did go into a little bit of a victim mentality, that kind of sense of, well, really, going by Goering's dates, there should have only been a few weeks for you. And it's the fact that it starts unfurling into months. That's when that victim mentality really comes in and they feel like they're really taking the brunt of it. But just to sort of finish on that point, the thing is that they act as if that hasn't happened to other branches. And I mean, the Kriegsmarine during the Phoney War, for instance, felt very much like, well, we're kind of, looking at the Battle of the Atlantic and not much else happening on land and not as much happening in the air. They felt isolated at points. So it just happens. These are just war phases.
Yeah. And the movie almost echoes that in a way where they go, right, now it's our turn to have a crack at England. They don't go, oh, we need to help out the Wehrmacht by knocking out the RAF. That's going to really help Sea Lion. They go, right, it's on us. Yeah. And they sing the Stukas and all go into a dive.
Yeah, they do.
The movie does it in its own way. I mean, to sort of quickly sum up final thoughts quickly before we get into the large question. I mean, I think, as I've said before, I think it's well made for its time. The model work, the set pieces are good, but I found it really hard to get behind any of the characters, as I just felt it's obviously purely intentional on the film's part because of its propagandic nature. But there's hardly any characterization. There's very little. I say it a lot on the show. There's no skin in the game here. It's a 90-minute Stuka advert. And there's also, oddly, and probably on purpose, a lack of substance to what's going on. Like,
Yeah.
of course, on a modern audience, it's lost a little bit. You know, remember, everyone watching this in Germany in 41 has a understanding of what has happened, and of course they do. But it's, even then, the film is very thin on plot. It's very thin on the reasons why. It's very what we're doing, and I think that, to me at least now, 80 years on, wherever long it is, it makes it less of an enjoyable film, And I think it's just, you have to just take it in its context of its day. This isn't intended to be reviewed 80 years later. It's intended to be watched there and then move on to the next one.
Yeah, it is the epitome of what is the Nazi zeitgeist film, the contemporary film. It's very much the genre. That's its purpose. And really, that's all they care about, which is why and I think in a way it's designed to be vague, because it was meant to relate to so many different people in the Luftwaffe, in the Wehrmacht. And it's there to really uphold that sense of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community, which becomes the Kampfgemeinschaft, or the fighting community. And it's the sense of, one for all and all for one sort of thing. So it's not really designed to be distinct and to have memorable characters, because they're just meant to blend in and comply. That's what Nazi propaganda is.
Yeah, and I think with it being a propaganda film, you can't really depict numerous deaths, and the film tries to leverage this idea of self-sacrifice for the fatherland, etc., as you've already mentioned, but it doesn't, as Rob said, it doesn't put the skin in the game. You don't really feel when these pilots are killed that, oh, they've really sacrificed something there. You can't just have someone that sat at a table go, oh, isn't it a shame that Hans isn't here anymore? That doesn't really convey the power. But I think that's a stylistic and directorial choice. They don't want to have the Luftwaffe and the Stuka pilots associated with loss and death and failure. Although operationally, we all know that within any unit that's operational, there's always going to be loss and failure and death. That is the nature of war. But because this is aimed at the population, they might not fully understand this. You can kind of introduce them to that concept slightly through this kind of narrative. But one of the things I wanted to ask was, do you have any feeling for how this film and others like it, how successful they were in terms of their propaganda purpose for the greater German people that were kind of consuming these films? Because obviously they were within this broader ecosystem of propaganda, like newsreels, Hitler's speeches, local party things going on, that kind of stuff. It's all bombarding you with the same kind of levels of propaganda and repeating those key phrases and points.
Yes, good point. It's trickled through pretty much since the moment that Hitler has taken power in 1933. So it is an accumulative thing, propaganda. I think people, it's easy, as we all did, to look at the film and think, oh my God, what a load of tripe. But the thing is if you're hearing that from the cradle to the grave, you're hearing that every single day, some people, it will permeate their membranes in the brain, and it will take hold. I think what perhaps has the greatest influence in terms of Luftwaffe recruitment is actually more posters and also newsreels. So to some degree, obviously newsreels are used in the film, largely for Stuka footage that isn't easy to film themselves. But when I've sort of looked at different kinds of reasons that certain men had for joining the Luftwaffe, which I cover somewhat in Eagle Days, and I have a article coming out relatively soon with History of War, which looks more deeply at Luftwaffe training and recruitment. It tends to be more simplistic. I think we've got to remember that these were very young people being enticed into the Luftwaffe, and sometimes the reasons are very straightforward. It's like Klaus Däumling, for instance, who ends up becoming a bomber pilot later in the war. He remembers watching the newsreels of the Battle of Britain, and of course he was impressed by some of the Luftwaffe aces like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders and Helmut Wick and people like that. But he was himself far more impressed by the bombers that he saw on the film. And, he was a teenage boy seeing these massive Heinkels and Dorniers and and the Junkers 88 and all of these different aircraft. And they've had years of this, that this is the way they keep track of the war, is through these newsreels. So I think it's one of those things that sometimes it's a very visceral reaction. And of course, the Nazi propaganda helps to make that even more enticing to some degree. But I think it's sort of a mixture of the two. It's kind of, here's the cool flying that you'd get to do, but also you get to do it for the fatherland. And that's a really enticing thing to do when in this era, young boys don't want to be left out. They want to be in the fighting.
It's the power of the Wochenschau. You know, you watch any of them throughout the war. It's always, look what we're doing. You know, look at how decorated you can be. You know, look at how powerful we are, even when the war is lost. You know, you look at some of those later ones. They're still. I remember watching one from late 45, and they're still going on about how, you know, the glorious defenders of Berlin, and they're still getting medals, and it's all fine. You know, even when all is lost, it's still this propagandic machine. But no, I think it's an interesting movie. I think it you know, in its context. I mean, now. It's actually a controlled film within Germany. You can't see this movie without, requesting a copy. It can't be screened in theaters, like a lot of Ritter's work, war work. It is available online. You can find it. There's no DVD of it, of course. But you know, I just find that interesting that even now these films are still controlled because of the sort of messaging within them. But I think now is the time to turn on to the large question, which was Matt's question this week, and we got some good replies. What warplane would you like to see a movie be made about? So Ricardo, straight out the gate, said the Junkers J87 Stuka. So we've just covered it there, Ricardo. We had Chris at Film and Dart, who said, I would like the Halifax to get more representation, maybe not as famous as the Lancaster, but a fine aircraft. Adam Christian again, Halifax. Nick Lahari goes Buccaneer, Whirlwind. Kerry Thomas says Sea Harrier over the Falklands and Beaufighters in the Far East. Yes, please. Ooh. Brian Williams, who says the Ferry Battle, the Meuse River attack in 1940 could be the attack on the Death Star with ferry battles as the Y-Wings. Yes, please. Then we have Robert O'Sullivan, who says the SE-5A biplane, and he quotes Derek Robson's Goshawk Squadron. We have Roku Haddo, who says the Mosquito. I think there's a lot of people who would want a Mosquito movie.
I would say Mosquito.
Yeah.
The nuisance raids. I mean, filming the nuisance raids going over Berlin would just be amazing. Sorry to interrupt, but
please
that's
do.
Very evocative.
Rebecca Greenwood Harding says Falkland film focusing on Sea Harriers or first Gulf film focusing on the Tornado. That would be very good.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good.
Make Tornado Down into a film. That'd be great.
Yeah. That would be, and then, that would be the obvious way.
I think rounding us out before we get to our own this week, we had about 30, 40 replies. So sorry if I don't get to you. Alex W said Beaufighter, anti-shipping, or the short Sunderland. I think that'd be something. I really do.
What about you, Victoria? You said you had a couple of ideas there.
Yes, so Mosquito I completely agree with. I think it'd be so hard to film now because, of course, it's not flying, but the Vulcan as well I think would be fascinating to cover. I mean, there's several. I think, to be fair, there are some interesting German aircraft, but you'd have to shoot it in a very careful way. I mean, you could do the Messerschmitt Me-262, but you'd have to do it in such a way that it's kind of you could do it from the Allied perspective of all the rumours and whispers about the fact that there is this, the world's first operational jet fighter might be on the horizon. But yeah, I think that, I don't know, for me, the Vulcan, I'd like to see more of that, but at the same time, unfortunately it retired quite a few years ago now, so that there may be some CGI, and I'm a little bit of an old school girl with war films, and that if you can't actually see it flying, I don't like it as much.
That's fair. Yeah, that's a good thing. Matt, what about you?
Well, we've already talked about them. I'd quite like to see the Defiance doing the infamous possible scissoring of German bombers over London. Because we've actually talked about that before when we've talked about films we'd like to see. I think someone's mentioned wanting a Bolt and Paul Defiant film.
Yeah, we did.
Or a film about the Gloucester meteor. That'd be quite cool. Like the making of,
Oh,
and
the
then
meteor,
the operational,
yes.
and then like flicking the V1 bombers out the sky. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
And shooting them down. That'd be great.
I've gone for a Top Gun style film set in Desert Storm with the A-10 Thunderbolt.
Oh,
Just because it's just iconic, isn't it? The its cannon going off. Lovely. Really good stuff. So that was another episode of Fighting on Film. Victoria, it's been incredible to talk to you about the Stuka and this movie. I mean, it's been a long time coming and a fascinating episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me both. And thank you so much for this concept of a podcast as well, because it's so easy, I think, to just watch war films and we have our own way of digesting them. But I love the way that you guys get into so many different elements.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Go and check out Victoria's book, Eagle Days. It's out now. If you're listening on the day of release of this podcast, it'll be out tomorrow. Congratulations on the book. I read about 6 chapters when you sent it across. I will admit, this is sacrilege to say it to you, but I'm not a super aviation kind of guy.
We're landlubbers on the show, really.
Interests. But we're terrible. I'm like Rob with boats. Rob can't do boats. It's
so much so that I call the cockpit,
the bridge.
I don't know what you call it, the bridge. See, I call it a viewing room, and that's become a thing on the show.
Unironically,
you view the sea from it. It makes complete sense. Come on,
you do. It does make sense. It does.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, for me to be, enthralled by something like that is, a testament to really great writing. So, congratulations on the book and good luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Yes, and all that's left to say from me is do join us again for Fighting on Film. Check out the socials, the Fourth Faithful page on Facebook. It's a really good place to get involved in the conversation. Like, follow, and share whatever you're listening on. Leave us a review, and we'll catch you next week for more Fighting on Film. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.